Chapter 9, The Great Esquimaux Curlew. It took a while, but the first Saturday of May, spring finally decided to stick around. Mr. Loeffler said it was the latest spring he'd ever seen. But that probably meant it would be the warmest, and he was right. I didn't even need my flight jacket anymore, which didn't mean that I stopped wearing it. By that first Saturday, everything had jumped from brown to green, and if you stood in front of the Marysville Free Public Library and looked at the maples up and down the street, you could watch their gold leaves unfurl like little flags, waving for all they were worth, which, after a long winter, was a lot. I pulled the Saturday deliveries past people dragging last year's leaves from under their bushes, cutting back hedges, digging up gardens by the curbs, and raking like the Marysville garden inspector was going to stop by in the afternoon. It was that kind of day. Back at Spicer's Deli, I told Lil that everything looked as green as New Zealand, and she said, "How would you know?" Which I think meant that I hadn't exactly done half of the work for Mr. Barber's New Zealand project that we had handed in together. But I'm no chump. "I'll buy you a Coke and show you how green it is," I said. "Does that mean I'm supposed to go get Cokes for the two of us?" I shook my head. I took 2 quarters out of my pocket and laid them on the deli counter. Lil chinged open the register and slid them into the drawer, and I went over to the refrigerator and back and got 2 bottles of Coke, took their caps off, and brought them up front. There was froth at the tops of the bottles, and Lil could hardly keep from giggling when she took her first sip. "It always goes up my nose," she said. She was beautiful. She walked with me to Mrs. Windermere's, and I'm not lying, everything was even greener than it had been in town when I was making deliveries earlier that morning, by a lot. The maples, the oaks, the grass, the ferns coming up beside the road, the fields, especially the fields, which even smelled green. "You were right," said Lil. She took my hand and walked up to Mrs. Windermere's slowly. It was still too short. At the house, there was a car I hadn't seen before, about 1.5 blocks long. It was so long that it didn't fit in the turnaround. Half of it was on the grass, gleaming everywhere. We went to the back, and I unlocked the door with the so-secret key, and Lil and I brought the groceries in and put them all away, and we started out because we had the whole slow walk back to look forward to, and then Mrs. Windermere came in with Mr. I own the gleaming car next to her. "Skinny delivery boy," she said. "Mrs. Windermere," I said, "do you think that maybe you could call me something else?" "No. Is everything put away already?" "Yep." We were just going. I reached for Lil's hand. "And this is Lillian Spicer," said Lil. "It's nice to meet you, Lillian." "Thank you," said Lil. "It's very nice to meet you." She was always so polite. "Did I tell you that she has green eyes? Did I tell you that she's beautiful?" "So is Lillian your girlfriend?" said Mrs. Windermere. Everything stopped. Everything. "Skinny delivery boy, you know I never beat around the bush. Yes or no?" I looked at Lil. She looked at me. She wasn't planning to be helpful with this. I looked back at Mrs. Windermere. "Yes," I said. I looked back at Lil, smiling. Mrs. Windermere said, "Mr. I own the gleaming car." "And this," said Mrs. Windermere, "is Mr. Gregory, who was supposed to be producing my play at the end of the month, but who was not making much headway. Who is making the best headway any producer could possibly make with a writer who is," started Mr. Gregory. "Mr. Gregory likes strawberry ice cream," said Mrs. Windermere. "I do not like strawberry ice cream," said Mr. Gregory. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Windermere. "Everybody likes strawberry ice cream. What kind did I order?" "Raspberry sherbet," said Lil. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Windermere. She shook her head. "That's too bad." "Raspberry sherbet," said Mr. Gregory. We all sat down to small bowls of raspberry sherbet, except for Mr. Gregory, who sat down to a bowl of raspberry sherbet about as big as New Zealand, because he hadn't had a raspberry sherbet since he was a boy, and he thought he should make up for lost time. I think he might be a good guy. At least, he looked like he might be a good guy. You can't look like Mr. I own the gleaming car when you're eating a huge bowl of raspberry sherbet in someone's kitchen. "So are all the actors ready for the play?" said Lil. "That's the problem," said Mrs. Windermere. "Mr. Gregory hasn't cast them all yet." "You have no idea how difficult it is to find actors for as many parts as we need for this script," said Mr. Gregory. "If only a certain writer had been willing to—" "A certain writer won't," said Mrs. Windermere. "Who do you still need?" "Helen Burns, to start with," said Mr. Gregory. "Helen Burns," said Mrs. Windermere slowly. "To start with," said Mr. Gregory. Mrs. Windermere looked at Lil. There she is, right there, Skinny Delivery Boy's girlfriend. Mr. Gregory looked at Lil. I'm not an actor, said Lil. No, you would be an actress, said Mrs. Windermere, and Lillian. Every young girl, once she steps upon a Broadway stage, enjoys the thrill of being an actress. Not me, said Lil. The right voice, the right manner, even the right hair. I think she'd be perfect, said Mr. Gregory. How old are you? I'm 25, said Lil. Have you ever acted before? Said Mr. Gregory. Lil stood up. No, and I won't be acting now. She's really, really good, I said. Lil looked at me like she was going to throw the rest of her raspberry sherbet in my face. Really, I said. Lil looked back at Mr. Gregory. She smiled sweetly, sort of. Then she pointed at me. Do you have a part for him? She said. Mr. Gregory shook his head. No, he said, not for a young boy. I smiled at Lil sweetly, sort of. Perhaps the voice of Bertha Mason, said Mrs. Windermere. The voice of Bertha Mason, I said. Can you shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years? Said Mrs. Windermere. I've heard Doug shriek like that lots of times, said Lil. I looked at her. She smiled even more sweetly. No, I said. Lil looked at Mr. Gregory and shrugged. If he won't shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years, then I won't be Helen Burns. Then you're not Helen Burns, I said. Fine, she said. Fine, I said. I sure did wish we had gotten out of that kitchen as soon as we had put the deliveries away. Then that's that, said Mrs. Windermere. That's that, I said. I'll see you next week, Skinny Delivery Boy, said Mrs. Windermere. I'll see you next week, I said. Fine, she said. Fine, I said. Lil and I dropped our bowls and spoons into the sink, and we went to the door. Goodbye, Mr. Gregory, Lil said. And that was the mistake. She shouldn't have stopped to say goodbye. It's like those horror movies where the person about to be mauled to death could have saved herself if she'd only taken one more step, but she stops to be polite or something. I took Lil's hand. We were almost through the door. Gregory, said Mrs. Windermere loudly, what have you done with that snowy heron I gave you? I stopped. I've already told you I haven't done a thing with it. I hate birds, and I hate pictures of birds. I wonder if we might find a better place for it than rolled up and put away in your closet. I turned around. Such as, said Mr. Gregory. The snowy heron, I said. Mrs. Windermere turned to me. Yes, she said. She turned back to Gregory. Mr. Gregory. I wonder if we might make a present of it to someone. The snowy heron, I said again. Audubon's snowy heron? Excuse me, Skinny Delivery Boy. Yes, we could make a present of it to someone who, say, helped out in the performance. Mrs. Windermere cupped her chin in her hand. Just a thought, she said. I looked at Lil. Helen Burns is a great part. I said. Wait a minute, said Lil. Why don't we all sit down and have another bowl of raspberry sherbet, said Mrs. Windermere. You remember the snowy heron, right? If you saw the snowy heron, if you saw how beautiful the snowy heron was, if you saw how perfect he looks in Audubon's book, then you would be willing to shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years, too. You would. It took more than a little bit of convincing to get Lil to be Helen Burns, which really is a great part, even though she dies. You might wonder how I finally convinced her. It happened on Monday, in geography. When Mr. Barber announced that we were going to be doing one more team project for the year, it was going to be on the role of transportation in a country's development, and when Mr. Barber asked who would like to do the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, Lil raised her hand and said that she would do it with me. Is that okay with you, Douglas? Said Mr. Barber. Lil looked at me and mouthed the words, Helen Burns. Terrific, I said. You might wonder who is going to have to do almost everything on this project because one of us has a real part in a Broadway play with real lines, which, like the other one, just has to stand off stage and scream like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years, and that same one of us did diddly on the New Zealand project, and so the one with the real part in the Broadway play figures that the one without a real part in the Broadway play has a lot to make up for. I'm starting to feel like a chump. But whenever I feel like a chump, I remember the snowy heron. If you saw the snowy heron. When Mr. Barber found out about the Broadway play, he said that since Lil and I were going to be working so hard to put this play, we only had to turn in a 500-word report on the Transcontinental Railroad. I didn't look at Lil when Mr. Barber said this. She couldn't have been smiling, but I was. When Mr. McElroy found out about the Broadway play, he wanted to take a whole period talking about the role of actors in world history, but the only actor that any of us could think of was John Wilkes Booth. "I guess actors aren't so important after all," said Mr. McElroy. "You can't imagine an actor ever becoming a president of the United States, for example," which was true. We couldn't. When Mrs. Verne found out about the Broadway play, she took a whole period off from solving equations with at least two unknowns to talk about her own college acting career, which had a whole lot of lines in Greek that she could still recite and which I'm not going to write here because I don't even know how. When Miss Cowper found out about the Broadway play, I thought she was going to walk on air right there in front of us. She said that she hadn't heard such good news in a long time. We would have to stop the introduction to poetry unit prematurely, she said, and move directly into the modern drama unit so that the class could support Lillian and Douglas. Would we please pass forward our poetry anthologies? I'm not lying. The whole class loved us. You can only take so much poetry, especially when it's poetry by Percy Bysshe Shelley, who is still going to get it right in the face someday. When Coach Reed found out about the Broadway play, he smiled and said he wasn't surprised. Maybe he's turning into a good guy too. When Mr. Ferris found out about the Broadway play, Clarence didn't stop rocking during the whole lab, which involved sulfur, which is something you really don't want to smell like, but which we all did by the time we were finished, but Mr. Ferris promised we wouldn't smell like that by the time the curtain came up. And when Mr. Powell heard about the Broadway play, he went over to the Birds of America and turned pages until he came to the one he wanted. "Look at this one," he said. We did. The great Esquimau Curlew, an actor if there ever was one. He was right. The great Esquimau Curlew looked like he was just coming on stage, his body leaning forward, his neck stretched out, his bill stuck up in the air like he was about to sing or something. The composition was stable, with his body right in the center, against a mound of grasses, also in the center. And the whole thing that upset all this was his bill, which you looked at first because he seemed to stick out above the scenery, and it was upside down. "Am I supposed to look like that when I come on stage?" said Lil. "I'm no chump." I didn't say anything. On Tuesday and Friday evenings and Saturday afternoons for the rest of May, Mr. Spicer drove Lil and me down into New York City and dropped us off at the Rose Theater, where Mr. Gregory was always standing outside waiting for us and making it look like we were late. On the drive down, Lil went over her Helen Burns lines again and again and again and again. "Miss Scratchard is hasty. You must take care not to offend her. Do you think it's Scratchard or Scratcherd?" she said. "Scratcherd," I said. She tried it out. She tried it out again. "Scratcherd," she said. That's how it was pretty much the whole way down to New York City. And just so everyone knows the stats, number of times I repeated Lil's lines with her. Something over 6,000. Number of times I had to correct her. Something over 60,000. Number of times we drove down to New York City before I had all her lines down myself. 6. Number of times she asked me to say my lines. 0, which is probably because she didn't want me shrieking like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years while we were locked inside a car. And now I'm not lying. I was a great shrieker. I'd been practicing too. If you are going to get this right, you can't just shriek. Anyone can do that. To shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years, you have to practice. The first time I practiced was in our bathroom, and when Lucas heard it, he tried to roll his wheelchair right up the stairs because he figured there was a bloody murderer at my throat. He got 3 steps up before I heard him. After that, he said I had to practice outside. So I went to the green field on the way to Mrs. Windermere's house and hoped that no one was around. Here's how you practice shrieking like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years. You stand in the middle of the field. You look around to be sure no one is going to hear you. You breathe in a couple of times to get as much air into your chest as you can. You stretch your neck up like the great Esquimau Curlew. You imagine that it's Game 7 of the World Series, and it's the bottom of the 9th, and Joe Pepitone is rounding third base, and the throw is coming in, and the catcher has his glove up waiting for the ball, and Joe Pepitone is probably going to be out, and the game will be over, and the Yankees will lose. Then you let out your shriek, because that's how everyone in Yankee Stadium would be shrieking right then. That's how you practice shrieking like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years, and you keep doing it over and over again until all the birds in Marysville have flown away. I'm not lying. I got good at this. If you had heard me shrieking, you would have thought someone was being murdered too. It was so eerie. You might have thought that someone who had been murdered was shrieking. You might even have thought that someone who had been murdered had come back and was murdering the murderer, who was shrieking. That's how good I was. When the cast of Jane Eyre heard me shriek from off stage for the very first time, they all looked around to see who had done it, and then they started clapping. That's pretty good. Lil said I was a natural. It hardly sounded like I was acting at all. And how was I doing on the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States? Mr. Gregory said I might have to tone it down a bit, since we didn't want people in the first 2 rows fainting away. When Mrs. Windermere said I might have to tone it down a bit, since we didn't want people in the first 2 rows wetting their pants. It got so that I liked the rehearsals, even though it meant that I couldn't be drawing the Great Esquimalt Curlew with Mr. Powell on Saturday afternoons. But I loved watching Lil on stage. I loved listening to her lines, which, as you might remember, I already knew by heart. It was, for the record, scratch-erd, and I didn't say anything, even after Mr. Gregory had to correct her for the 3rd time. And I loved when Lil looked out into the seats to see if I was watching her, which I always was. In May, Lucas was hired for 3 stupid jobs. You can imagine how that felt, and you can imagine how it felt when he got fired from all 3 stupid jobs. The first time was from the Gulf station, and it wasn't his fault. Things started out all right, but then there were 3 stupid days of stupid rain in a row. When people drove up to get gas, Lucas would wheel out from the garage as quick as he could. He'd come around to the door and find out how much gas they wanted, and then wheel around to the pump and pump it. Then come back around to the door to get the money. Then wheel back to the garage to get their change and their genuine crystal goblet, since Gulf was running a special. By then, he was pretty drippy, so when Lucas's boss was driving home and he saw one of his old customers at the Sunoco station instead, he stopped and asked him how come he wasn't at his Gulf station, and the jerk told him he couldn't stand to have a guy with no legs wheel himself out in the rain all that time just to pump gas, and so he decided to go to the Sunoco station. Lucas got fired the next morning. We can't be losing our most dependable customers, his stupid ex-boss said. The second time was from the A&P, when Lucas had to hold onto the edge of a display to shove some oranges high up, and the stupid edge broke off in his hand. You can imagine what happened to all the oranges. His boss fired him right there, with all the oranges around him. He wouldn't even give him his salary, because who was going to pay for all those stupid, ruined oranges? The third time was from the Bank of Catskills, where Lucas was a teller for a whole 2.5 hours on a Saturday morning until Mrs. Rothk came in and asked him to deposit 3 checks and to cash the 4th, and he cashed the wrong one, she said. She complained loudly enough that the manager came over, and Lucas explained that he had cashed the one she had asked him to cash, and he was already fixing the problem. And Mrs. Roth said she wasn't going to be lied about by the likes of him, and she had heard what soldiers did in Vietnam, and he was probably so drug-addled that he couldn't take proper directions from anyone, and how was someone like that to be trusted in a bank? And it wasn't a bank's business to take up hard luck cases like him, at least not a bank that she would care to put her money into. Lucas didn't even wait. He willed himself out of the bank. Christopher was supposed to meet him after work to get him down the stairs out front, but Lucas decided he would take them himself. At the bottom, he wouldn't let anyone help him back into the chair. He told Christopher it took him half an hour. It was probably longer than that. I guess he wasn't actually fired from that job. I guess he quit. Sort of. When I got back from New York City that night, Lucas was alone in the living room watching some John Wayne Western, where John Wayne was riding horses and climbing over fences and walking that way he walks. The television was the only thing on in the room. At the first commercial, I asked him how things were going. Swell, he said. I asked him how work was. He told me. We left all the lights off so I couldn't see that he was crying. If Mrs. Roth had been there, I would have punched her right in the face. The play was going to open at the Rose Theater in New York City on the last Friday of May. That week, you would have thought that Lil was blasting off to the moon. She was that nervous. She had stomach aches almost every day. She missed 2 of her advanced algebra assignments, which had never happened before, even once. She forgot to she forgot to read the first act of Our Town, which wasn't missing much, and I'm not lying, and she never even asked how I was doing on the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, which if she would have asked, I would have told her was going to get the Golden Spike Award, which she wouldn't have understood because, as you might remember, there's only one of us working on this report. During class, she mostly held her stomach and chewed on her pencils. She bit all the erasers off and ate them. Then she gnawed on all the metal tips until they came off. Then she started in on the wood. There were yellow splinters all around her desk. Mrs. Verne said it was perfectly normal for an actress. When she played the tragic Jocasta, she had gone through 3 fountain pens. On that last Friday, Mr. Ferris set Clarence rocking on the table as soon as class started. "This is, if I am not mistaken, the day," he said. Lil turned red, then white, then red again. "Lil Spicer," said Mr. Ferris, "what little I know of biology suggests that neither the gum of the eraser, nor the tin of the metal top, nor the wood of the pencil shaft, nor the lead of the interior will do much for your digestive system." "I can't help it," she said. Mr. Ferris went over to her desk. He took the pencil from her hand and examined it, and since there wasn't much left, it wasn't a long examination. "Lil Spicer," he said, still looking at the pencil, "perhaps during today's experiment you should allow Doug Spuddick to handle the more toxic chemicals." Lil nodded. Mr. Ferris went back to the front. "A few days ago," he said, "Apollo 10 descended to 8.4 miles above the lunar surface to practice a moon landing. The astronauts described the Earth as a tiny blue, brown, and white basketball suspended in the void of outer space. They said that the moon is pitted with holes and that it is illuminated clearly by Earth's reflected light. They said that some of the craters seemed to glow softly." He threw the pencil stub in the garbage can. "Lil Spicer," he said, "you and Doug Spuddick are doing something extraordinary in an extraordinary time. You were the first Washington Irving Junior High School students to perform in a Broadway play, as far as I know. You are the first citizens of Marysville to perform in a Broadway play. There is no need to be nervous." He leaned forward over the lab table. "The Apollo missions have already descended close to the moon's surface, and you two have already succeeded." If you could have seen Lil smile, if you could have seen her relax into her chair, and if you could have seen my mother in hat and white gloves when she got into the Spicers' car to go see a Broadway play that her son was in, if you could have seen her. We recited Lil's lines together all the way down into New York City that afternoon, and even though she was so nervous that she had a stomach ache again, she got every line right, except for Scratch-Erd. We stopped at a White Castle on the way down and ate about 24 hamburgers. Lil gave me her onions and I scraped my pickles onto her hamburger. But my mother and Mr. and Mrs. Spicer couldn't eat at all. They were too nervous, they said, and even Lil ate only one. At the theater, Mr. Gregory was, of course, waiting for us. He looked pretty nervous, too. He bundled us inside like we were 2 hours late instead of 2 hours early. He sent Lil into the dressing room so that she could start becoming Helen Burns. I didn't have to do anything. If you're off stage, you shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years without looking like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years. So I read Our Town, terrific, while Lil got ready, and my mother and Mr. and Mrs. Spicer went for a walk in Times Square because they couldn't bear to wait in the theater, they said, and besides, my mother had never seen Times Square. And that is why they were not around when Mr. Gregory came looking for them. "They're out for a walk," I said. His face looked like disaster. "What?" I said. Mrs. Windermere happened to make her theater appearance right then, blue dress flouncing, a couple of 100 strands of pearls draped around her, an ivory cane that she didn't really need. "Gregory," she said, "this is the night." Mr. Gregory looked at her. "What's happened?" she said. "Come with me," he said. "What's going on?" I said. "Everything's fine," said Mrs. Windermere. "Sure." They were gone a long time. While I waited to see how fine everything was, I watched the theater fill up through this little hole in the stage wings. Mrs. Windermere said that she had never had a play open without a packed house, and it looked like she was going to keep her stats perfect. The rows was filling up pretty fast, and it wasn't filling up with just anybody. I'm not lying. Mayor Lindsay came down the aisle, shaking hands with everyone who could reach him and smiling like this was a parade or something. And a little farther after him came Jimmy Stewart. Really, Jimmy Stewart, walking down and shaking hands too with those huge hands he has. Jimmy Stewart. But you know what? That was nothing. I saw my mother and Lil's parents come in and sit in the second row, and then Mr. Gregory going out to see them, and then all getting up and heading backstage, I guess to wish me and Lil good luck one more time. And then, right near where the seats were, guess who came in and sat down? Just sat down real easy and crossed his legs and leaned back and looked up at the ceiling a couple of times and then turned around to someone and shook his hand and then turned around to someone else and took his program and signed it. You know who this was? Joe Pepitone. I'm not lying. Joe Pepitone was sitting in the second row of the Rose Theater. Joe Pepitone. And you know what I was going to do? I was going to shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years in front of Joe Pepitone. You know what that feels like? You can't know what that feels like because no one has ever had to shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years in front of Joe Pepitone. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. Not in front of Joe Pepitone. I looked through the little hole in the stage wings again. He was reading his program. He was probably getting to the part where it said, Voice of Bertha Mason, Douglas Swedick. Any second now, he was going to lean over to someone near him and point to my name. Isn't that a guy? He was going to say, how can a guy play the voice of Bertha Mason? Then he was going to look at my name again, and he was going to say, you know, that name sounds familiar. And then he was going to think about it some more, and he'd say, that name is so familiar. And then he was going to remember. Terrific. I looked around wildly, and suddenly there were my mother and Mr. and Mrs. Spicer and Mr. Gregory and Mrs. Windermere and Lil, who was taking her turn looking like disaster. We've got to get out of here, I said. Mrs. Spicer nodded. We know. We're going to take her to the hospital right away. Her? Hospital? We think it might be the pencils, said Mr. Spicer. Lil smiled, sort of. She was holding onto her parents pretty tight. She had been crying. Break a leg, she said. She was still crying. Break a leg? I said. It's what is said to actors before they go on stage, said Mr. Gregory. On stage? I said. Lil tried to smile again. Remember, Doug, it's scratch heard. I shook my head. I am not going on stage. My mother put her hands up to her face. Mrs. Windermere came and stood beside me. She put one hand on my shoulder and another on my elbow. Who else knows all the lines for Helen Burns? She said. I looked at her. I looked at Mr. Gregory, at my mother, then Mr. and Mrs. Spicer, then Lil. Break a leg, she said again, sort of weak. He'll be fine, said Mrs. Windermere. No, I said. We've got to get you to the dressing room, said Mr. Gregory. No, I said again. Remember who was sitting in the audience, in the second row. You know the lines, don't you, said Mr. Gregory. No, I said. He's lying, said Lil. If we were to tie his hair up into a bun, and some baby powder to make his face pale. Baby powder? Do you know that Joe Pepitone is sitting out there? A great many people are sitting out there, said Mr. Gregory. Lil grimaced, but not because of Joe Pepitone. I think we'd better... The Spicers left. Lil's stomach was hurting so bad she didn't even look back. Mr. Gregory and Mrs. Windermere took me to the dressing room. This is what we have to work with, they said to a whole lot of people who began to smile at me a whole lot. And they weren't the kind of smiles that make you happy. Listen, I said, if this is just because of a stomach ache, remember, said Mrs. Windermere, people were starting to tie up my hair into a bun. Jane Eyre will walk across the stage and address you. You'll be reading a book on a bench. Jane won't speak to you until you turn the page, so don't forget to turn it. Then she'll say, is your book interesting? And you say, skinny delivery boy. You say, nope, it stinks. Doug, said Mrs. Windermere. I say I like it, and she says, what is it about? And I hand it to her and say, you may look at it. By this time, my hair was tied up in a bun, a tight bun, and someone was powdering the back of my neck. Could you go out there and tell Joe Pepitone to go home? I said. And when she says, do you like the teachers here at Lowood Institution? You say, they stink too. Mrs. Windermere looked at me, hard. They're all criminally insane. I think Mr. Gregory was about to start crying right there, even though it wasn't him who was getting his hair tied up in a bun, which, by the way, hurts. You have to get this right, Mr. Gregory said, and I think it was the have to that gave me the idea. Even as someone told me to raise my arms so she could slip a long Lowood Institution dress over me, which didn't exactly help the bun. Mrs. Windermere, I said, I know the part, but this changes things. What do you mean? I mean, Lil and I were getting the Snowy Heron for this, right? She nodded, a little suspicious. If I'm going to play Helen Burns in front of Joe Pepitone, then I want the red-throated divers too. Mrs. Windermere opened her eyes wide. I mean, really wide. I've had those divers for years, she said. I waited. That wasn't part of our agreement. I waited. They're perfect over the mantel. They're perfect back in the book, I said. She shook her head. Absolutely not. Do you realize how much that plate costs? I waited some more. Agreed, said Mr. Gregory. There it was. Mrs. Windermere looked at him the way an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years would look at him. It's not your decision, Gregory, she said. It's my theater, it's my production, it's my reputation, and it's my money, said Mr. Gregory. He held out his hands. I shook it. I could use a bowl of lemon ice cream, said Mrs. Windermere. I'm not lying. I was a killer. Helen Burns. I stepped out onto that stage like I was the great Esquima Curlew. When Jane Eyre came to look at my book, which happened to be Our Town, I handed it to her just right. When Mrs. Scatcherd told me I never cleaned my nails, I was about as quiet and innocent as a large-billed puffin. When she hit me a dozen times with a bunch of twigs, I was the brown pelican. I didn't bat an eye. And you'd try getting hit a dozen times with a bunch of twigs, and when I had to die, people were crying, really. And you know why? Because I was a black-backed gull, and so people cried like Helen Burns was their best friend. Maybe even Joe Pepitone was crying. Who knows? And Mr. Gregory was crying too, probably in relief. You should have heard the clapping as the curtain came down on dead Helen Burns. When I got to the wings, Mr. Gregory picked me up and hugged me and twirled me around and got baby powder all over himself, and I had to tell him to let me go since I was headed back to the dressing room because I wasn't going to be Helen Burns any longer than I had to. And was someone going to help me get this stupid bun untied? By the way, you can guess what my mother was doing in the wings. But the best part was still to come. Maybe it was because of the Helen Burns applause, or maybe it was all the practice, or maybe it was because Joe Pepitone was in the second row. But I let out the Bertha Mason shriek, and by the time the first echoes finished bouncing back from the mezzanine, I wasn't the only one in the Rose Theater who was shrieking. It was that good. I bet that everyone there really did think that there was an insane woman who had been locked in the attic of the theater for a great many years, and they had just heard her. I guess the rest of the play was all right. I spent some of it reading Our Town and some of it working on the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States report, which was almost finished even though a certain someone hadn't written a single word, and now she would probably say that she was so sick that she couldn't write a thing. Terrific. But I'm not lying. What I was thinking about more was a certain book and certain missing pages, and bringing those pages back to a certain library and handing them to a certain librarian, and me and Lil watching him put them back. I know what the red-throated divers are watching for. I know what the next spectacular thing is. By the time we got to the reader, I married him. A quiet wedding we had, he and I, the parson and the clerk, were alone present. It was almost 11 o'clock, and Mrs. Windermere still had to drive my mother and me back home, which meant it would be almost 1 o'clock before I even got close to sleep. But I didn't care. I'd finished laying the last transcontinental rail and pounded in the golden spike, and the audience was standing and hollering, and the next day I'd be handing 2 Audubon prints to Mr. Pell. What could be better? Who cares if Mrs. Windermere was taking forever being the playwright out in the lobby? Who cares if she was holding my mother beside her like her new best friend? What could be better? And about then, Joe Pepitone came backstage. He really did. Joe Pepitone backstage. Hey, kid, he said. I looked at him. Joe Pepitone. Doug, right? I nodded. Joe Pepitone. I threw with you last fall. You still got my cap? I nodded. Joe Pepitone. He laughed, a laugh that only Joe Pepitone could laugh. I saw your name in the program, so you were the guy who shrieked off stage. I nodded. You know, kid, you almost made me wet my pants. I laughed. He laughed. I tried to laugh like him. And you were Helen Burns, too. My heart stopped. You know what it means when your heart stops? It means that when you think that nothing could be better right about then, it all falls apart. If you remember, I told you that a long time ago. I nodded. Yep, I said. He shook his head, big smile. You were great, he said. You had me bawling, even though I knew it was you. Bawling, kid. He shook his head again. Man, he said, I wish I had your talent. You had the whole house tonight. Then he held out his program. I already have one, I said. He laughed again. It's not for you, kid. It's for me. I want you to sign it. He opened it up to where my name was. Right there, he said, and handed me a pen from his inside pocket like he had put it there on purpose, just so I could sign a program for him. So I did. And write something for Horace, too, he said. So I did. Here's what I wrote. For Joe and Horace. Thanks, your friend, Doug. Joe Pepitone took the program back and looked at it. Thanks for what? He said. Everything, I said. Mrs. Windermere drove us back home really late, but you might say that we were both more than a little happy because Mr. Gregory had called Jane Eyre a smash and told us it was going to have a long run. And so Mrs. Windermere was flying high. I was too, but mostly because Mr. Gregory had promised that if I stayed on as understudy, he would find another actress, to play Helen Burns until Lil came back. Fine by me. And you know what Mr. Gregory had given me and was now rolled up in a long tube in the back of the car? My mother and Mrs. Windermere and I sang about living in yellow submarines the whole way back, through Manhattan, across the Whitestone, and all the way up to Marysville. Sometimes when you keep singing the same song again and again and again and again, it gets really boring. Really, really boring. But not on that drive. It got funnier and funnier, so we finally had to stop singing around Middletown because I thought that Mrs. Windermere was going to drive off the road. That's how hard she was laughing. My mother was about crying. When we got back home, all the lights were on in the living room. We opened the door, and when we came in, Lucas and Christopher were there, sitting and looking at us. How did it go? Christopher said. Fabulous. I told them about Joe Pepitone. I told them about the shrieking, and I even told them about playing Helen Burns, which I hadn't intended to tell them. We know about Helen Burns, said Lucas. How? I said. Lucas looked down. Mrs. Spicer called a little while ago, and Christopher, from a hospital in the city. Didn't she tell you that Lil got a stomach ache from eating her pencils? I said. My mother took my hand. Little brother, Lucas said, it isn't a stomach ache. And the yellow shank finally walked into the full dark.